Good morning and welcome to one of my first videos for Mystic Physics. And this one we're going to focus on unity and wholeness, or unity as wholeness, and wholeness as unity, because this is one of the foundational concepts within mysticism, at least as far as I've both explored it and experimented with. So modern views of the world, we're working with fragments, we're working with pieces. So we tend to view the world as a collection of parts and pieces, kind of like these cubes that I use for drawing here. So with this fragmented worldview, our idea of unity is a lot of times, or wholeness, grab as many pieces as we can to create the model and reassemble the puzzle, because we're assuming that the world is broken in many ways. And it looks fragmented if we focus on the physical objects. But where things get interesting, at least for me, and possibly you as well if you're watching this video, is what it appears, and at least this is one interpretation, this is the interpretation I use, and with anything in mysticism, kick the tires, test this out for yourself, see if it makes sense. If it doesn't, message me or keep exploring. The biggest thing is about investigating and exploring on your own. So it's not a belief system. It's more akin, in that sense, bear with me, it's more akin to science, because with the breathing exercises, things like that, spiritual exercises, you're actually using your body as a lab, which we'll get to at some point. And even in martial arts, or art in general, things like flower arranging, you're kind of running the experiments to see what goes on. But part of what happens with it, part of the mindset, is that it's questioning the view of the world as being able to be completely modeled in terms of parts and pieces. Now, there's no question that this modern, fragmented, or physical-based perspective of the world has allowed us to do many, many, many things technologically. But one of the concerns, when I first came across this from a dialogue between the physicist David Bohm, who had gotten his doctorate from Oppenheimer, was friends with Einstein, and had regular conversations with the Dalai Lama, as well as Krishnamurti, is that people see the world through fragmentation, and that we have a fragmented view of the world. So when we view the world in terms of parts and pieces, we're still assuming fragmentation. And we're still assuming, and the issue of fragmentation is this idea of separateness. Now, this video, we're talking about unity and wholeness. So if we start from an assumption of parts and pieces, like this, kind of like a Lego model of the world, then what ends up happening is that we tend to view unity as a collection of pieces. We want to get people into agreement in terms of like ethics or politics, is where things like this tend to crop up. We're trying to get agreement, we're trying to get unity, we're trying to get unity by pulling different things together. And one of the things that's interesting with this is, one, we can never be sure that we have all the parts, right? Just from a purely practical view. We can never be sure that we have a complete picture this way. Now, how do we get around this? This is where it gets really interesting, because what it looks like is that the mystic traditions, and some of these go as far back as ancient Egypt, if you look at the writings in terms of poetic myth, or poetic riddles and poetic myths, poetic stories about the natural world, which Susan Bryn Morrow does brilliantly in her book, The Dawning Moon of the Mind, is you start with everything all at once, one big gulp. You find this idea in ancient Egypt, possibly by way of Egypt and ancient Greece, and also in Taoist China. And most mysticisms, you're starting with unity. But now the question is, well, if it's not a collection of parts and pieces, if it's not a collection of all these separate things, then what is it? What is this unity? And this is where like the 3-year-old, 3 to 5-year-olds would get a kick out of this. Like this is, if you've ever been around kids, you'll see them just laughing because they'll make jokes that adults just either don't get or that adults tend not to find funny. Well, the joke that's not a joke with this is instead of starting with parts and pieces, what the mystics did is, at least this is the interpretation I go with, and it makes sense, is you start with absolutely everything all at once. So you define unity in terms of wholeness. And it doesn't matter if you know what it is. And that's where things get really fun and odd and weird. Um, so if you define unity as everything, totality, well, one, you can't argue with it. This is not a logical thing. I have some friends, I have a German friend who's like, well, you're just starting with another belief. And yes, in some ways, when we're talking about parts and pieces, we're talking about a belief system here, that things can be modeled in parts and pieces and the world's made of parts and pieces. But where it gets wild with the unity, this starting with absolutely everything, in order to contradict that, you'd have to say there's nothing. And then you and I wouldn't be having this conversation, this dialogue through time, or the sharing through time here. And so you'd say that, well, then nothing exists. Because what we're doing is we're taking all of existence in one big gulp. The Zen masters say, well, how do you swallow a red hot iron ball? You don't just throw it in your mouth and wiggle it around like a jawbreaker. You swallow it one big gulp at a time. And that's what we're doing with the universe. So we're taking it all in one big giant gulp. And where it gets interesting is then it doesn't become an object anymore, because by definition, there's nothing outside of it. And this is where like the 3 to 5-year-old, when they get an adult in a quandary, this is the glimmer. This is the glimmer of the mystics, right? There's always a sense of humor. You look at someone like the Dalai Lama, there's this joy, because not because they know something, but because they see the paradoxes, the playfulness of the universe itself. So we start with everything all in one big gulp, which means there's nothing outside of it, not even emptiness, because a lot of times when we start with the fragmented view of the universe, the parts-based view, the more parts we aggregate, we're still dealing with in parts and then the outside. But if we're defining this as everything, even the space, even the emptiness, there's nothing outside of it. So what happens is it becomes unlimited. So all of totality taken as a whole is unbounded and unlimited, making it effectively infinite. And then what does this say about the parts and pieces? And I'll leave you with this. What happens is the parts and pieces, rather than being separate, don't arise out of, which is one thing that you'll hear people talk about sometimes in physics, implicate order, David Bohm, that the physical world arises out of the quantum world. This is not the view of the mystics. If we start with totality as a whole, then that means everything arises within the totality and fades away too, but it goes back into the original unity, this amorphous unknown that everything arises out of. And this is one of the things I write about. But for now, we're just going to start with this idea of unity as wholeness and not a collection of parts and pieces. So that means everything, excuse me, all particular things participate in the wholeness, in this unity. They're not really separate. They're participants. They're not parts and pieces. They're arising and passing away in Buddhist terms. There's a change going on here. And some of the things that we'll look at are these rhythms of change, these cycles of change and growth. But for now, if someone's looking at some of these mystic texts and saying that they make no sense, one of the things we'll cover is this idea of the 3 in 1, which we'll get to, and one of the things that I write about. But for now, The idea is we're taking absolutely everything, totality, all at once, even empty space, even emptiness, which is different than nothingness, because nothingness in this framework doesn't exist. It's non-existence and non-existence of things. It's complete annihilation. So we're starting with everything. And this is very much a physical view of the world. We don't know what that is. So we're starting with the unknown. But then what that gives us is the possibility of things arising within it, which means that none of these are really separate. They're all functions of that wholeness. And it leads into some really unusual things. But for now, I want to keep this just to this idea of unity, not as a collection of parts and pieces, but unity as wholeness, or everything, or totality, or absolutely everything. This is something that the mind, at least for me, cannot wrap itself around. There's the chance in things like spiritual enlightenment that you might be able to experience it directly. And this does set the stage for a physical model of the world, or a rational model of the world that allows for experiences like spiritual enlightenment, which we'll talk about in another video. But this is the starting point. Unity is wholeness, or the unity of wholeness. So that's really what we're getting at. Not unity is composed of parts and pieces, but rather that parts and pieces arise out of totality, or a whole. And until next time, enjoy pondering, which I do. This is not about answers. This is more about questions. Take care.